I was watching the NBA playoffs this year when I heard the announcers mention something really interesting. They said that the opening weekend of the 2025 NBA playoffs was one of the most watched in over 25 years. There was an average of 4.4 million viewers for the first round, and as a fan, this checks out. This year, the first round was one of the most exciting playoffs I've seen in recent years. The matchups were great and the competition was evident. So it didn't surprise me to hear this, but it did catch my attention. And that's when I started to wonder, what made this year's playoffs so special compared to the others? The NBA playoffs are home to the most competitive basketball in the world, so every year should be the most watched, but that's not the case. So what happened throughout the past 24 years of playoff basketball to make the 2025 playoffs one of the most viewed of all time? The thing is, there isn't an exact reason to why the past playoffs weren't the most viewed each year, but I do have a few ideas to what could have caused this, so here it goes. Now, the last few decades of playoff basketball weren't the most exciting if we're being real. And don't get me wrong, there were definitely a lot of great series throughout the years. But I feel like for the most part, repetition tends to lead to low viewership. What I really mean by that is that the playoffs and finals started to become predictable. And that's the worst thing that could happen to a sport. I felt like I saw the same teams and the same players walk their way through the playoffs year after year and make another finals appearance. And it's true, there are about 6 NBA teams that have made an impressive number of finals appearances within the past 24 years. From 2000 to 2024, the Lakers have made 8 finals appearances. The Heat made 7, the Spurs saw 5, and the Celtics just reached their 4th. And oh yeah, you can't forget about the obvious. The Cavaliers made 5 appearances, 4 of which are consecutive, and the Warriors have 6 appearances in an insane 8-year stretch. These teams have dominated the playoffs, and you might be asking, what's the point of this information? Well, to me, there are a few things. One is that these organizations have definitely figured out the winning formula for basketball. There's no doubt to that. But second, and most importantly, these teams are oversaturated with finals appearances. And this is why I think the playoffs haven't been the most exciting in recent years.
Ball game.
Missed everything.
The same dominant teams are consistently making it to either the playoffs or the finals. Meanwhile, some franchises are acting like they are world champions for finally sniffing the first round. But it's that same consistency that contributes to repetition and leads to boredom from a fan perspective. If you're a diehard fan of a struggling franchise, the playoffs are so irrelevant to you. You're already so used to not being in the mix, so why even bother watching? It's like a double-edged sword though. On one side, you might like to see a dynasty go for a three-peat, and on the other, you might be fed up from seeing the same team make it to the finals again and again, especially if they've been killing your team year after year. But no one likes reading the same story over and over again. It was actually nice to see a new team in the finals after 4 straight years. But basketball is a form of entertainment, and part of the fan experience is rooting for your favorite team to make the finals. And some of y'all fans have been waiting for that day, like it's some kind of prophecy. But there's a harsh reality. If your team isn't in the top 3 in their conference, they realistically do not have a chance to make it to the finals. I know, it sounds obvious, but just hear me out. Of course, everything is case by case, but if you look at the outcomes in the past 24 playoffs, you'll start to see a general pattern. Of the last 24 finals, 19 of them saw an appearance from a team in the top 3 seed. That's almost 80% of the time a top 3 team went to the finals. And this is intentional, and it's because of how powerful the NBA standings were for the past 2 decades. The NBA rewards the best performing teams with an easier first round matchup in the playoffs. In other words, having a great season means you should have an easier postseason with your team being favored to win. With that in mind, it gets even worse for fans of teams that don't even make it to the top 3. Since standings are a good representation to how good a team is, you can apply that to determining the outcome of a playoff series. It's simple. The first seed should beat the 8th, the second should beat the 7th, the third should beat the 6th, and the 4th should beat the 5th. But the 4th and 5th are a toss-up since they're usually evenly matched. And this is usually the case though. The higher seeded teams typically win their matchups. But the thing is, if your team isn't in the top 3, you really can't expect to win at all. But remember, while uncommon, upsets can still happen in the NBA, so there is still a chance for your team. From the 360 playoff series played between 2000 and 2019, there have been a total of 15 true upsets. That's about a 4.16% chance for an upset to occur. And I think that chance is what makes these playoffs exciting. Everyone likes an underdog, especially the fans of the underdog team. But But it's also so easy to count out a team and to not even bother watching this series just because you see how low the chances are. Many playoff series struggle to keep high viewership in these decades because they weren't particularly entertaining to a global audience. You can watch a series and pretty much tell it's going to be a blowout just because of how true the power rankings are. And you might even expect each series to be close or a good fight because it's good basketball. But historically, the lower seeded teams just can't compete in the playoffs. And this makes sense when you generalize the sport to statistics. But I think this contributed to why the playoffs weren't traditionally the most watched in previous years. The league was great during these decades, and there was a lot of talent that often gets forgotten. But the playoffs definitely suffered because it was dominated by the same successful organizations yearly. There was no room for smaller organizations that hovered just under the 500 mark to survive in the playoffs. If the playoffs were determined by one-game eliminations, we might see a drastic increase in viewership. That's why March Madness is such a good product. Nothing is predictable. But luckily, the culture is changing in the NBA. The draft lottery and big trades played a huge role throughout these past decades to help smaller organizations not only grow their fan base, but franchise success. It was a hard breakthrough for several rebuilding teams to compete against the powerhouse organizations, but it was especially trivial during the 2010s, or what's commonly referred to as the super team era. Most people would agree that throughout the 2000s, the Western Conference was arguably more competitive compared to the Eastern Conference. The skill gap was pretty evident, and the Eastern Conference had a bad reputation for being known as a cakewalk. This narrative carried on throughout the 2010s, but big name draft picks throughout the 2000s definitely closed the skill gap between both conferences, especially towards the end of this decade and throughout the next. Even in today's league, the conference is still not equal, but the competition within each conference is at an all-time high. But in the 2010s, there was another huge shift in the NBA. Besides just newly drafted stars, there was growing popularity of super teams. Players started to team up with other stars and dominated the league in pursuit for a championship. This hurt the playoff culture and furthered the skill gap across organizations. To some, matchups against a super team in the playoffs were simply unfair and unmatched, which in my opinion doesn't create good basketball. Blowouts are not fun to watch. Having a chance to compete is what makes the playoffs exciting. But despite being repetitive and unfair, some of these finals included super teams that ended up being some of the most viewed of all time. So even if we see the same teams in the playoffs or finals year after year, there tends to be strong viewership. So what do the fans want? What actually makes a good playoff series? What did this year's playoffs have that the other years don't? This is where I think that the super team era actually revealed something really important to the success of the postseason this year. As super teams were established, the league switched from having a lot of players focus on team-oriented basketball and team success to individual accolades and individual success-minded players. And that's when it clicked. It doesn't matter about what team is in the playoffs. What matters are what players are in the playoffs. I stopped caring about what teams were in the finals and was more excited about which player could get their first ring. This is because the super team era also caused a switch in how the fans viewed the playoffs and the finals. More fans were driven to root for a player getting a ring instead of an organization getting a ring. The end of the 2010s and the start of the 2020s really emphasized a new perspective to the NBA. The game today sees a lot of individual scoring and individual praise and less team-oriented basketball. The 2020s are what I call the new era of basketball. The new era has brought so many new stars to the league in such a short period of time. And with so much rising talent in the NBA, it's a battle to stand out. But this is really good for the NBA. Having a more leveled playing field of talent and personality on both sides not only brings fans, but more importantly, more viewership. I mean, I found myself watching teams I never cared about before because they finally ended up rebuilding around solid draft picks, like the Wizards, the Cavs, the Sixers, Pelicans, Timberwolves, Pistons, Hawks, and the Magic. And most of these teams are in the East. I never watched the East because it was historically bad. But now that we have solid draft picks getting chosen to the East, it becomes exciting to watch the talent. The new era and the new stars of the league have already made a huge impact and have turned losing franchises into winning organizations with at least a strong fan base, culture, and playoff identity. With new teams now finally entering the playoff scene after years of droughts, backed by their star players, the playoffs have quickly become more exciting. You can watch any team in the playoffs and they'll have around 4 to 6 notable players and 2 to 3 stars, which means that regardless of the seed ranking, you're going to watch good basketball. Yes, blowouts can and will still happen in the playoffs. The top teams should always still be the top teams, right? Well, get this. In the new era of basketball, seed rankings don't even matter. Since the introduction of the play-in tournament in 2020, the competition level across the NBA has started to become more relatively even for the top 8 teams. Seed rankings have become less accurate as a prediction of who could win a series, and that's because in the new era, you can't count any team out. Even if they are the 8th seed, you just never know anymore. Anything can happen, and it's already happening right in front of our eyes. To put some facts out there, in the 2020 finals, the Miami Heat were the first ever 5th seeded team in NBA history to make the finals. And just 4 years later, the Dallas Mavericks joined them as the second 5th seed team in NBA history to make it to the finals. And if it wasn't good enough, in 2022, the Miami Heat became the second 8th seeded team in history since 1999 to make it to the NBA finals. But even now, in just 2025, the 4th seeded Indiana Pacers have found themselves defying all the odds to face off against the 1st seeded Oklahoma City Thunder. The 4th seeded Pacers literally took out the 1st seeded Cavaliers, who just came off one of their best regular seasons in NBA history. Again, anything can happen in the new era. The seed rankings don't matter here. Within just the past 5 NBA finals, 4 teams have made an appearance and they were not in the top 3. This is crazy. Like seriously, these teams statistically should not be in the finals, and that's why the playoffs are exciting again. These insane playoff runs are happening more often than ever before. You pair that with good players, and suddenly every series is worth watching. And at this point, any team could go to the finals, not just the top 3. And it's kinda true, just because of how often upsets are occurring in the new era. Earlier I mentioned that within 20 years of playoff runs, there were only 15 recorded upsets. In just the past 5 years alone, there were a total of 16 upsets. Playoff risers are no joke. The playoffs these past 5 years have been consistently entertaining and unpredictable, and I like that. I think everyone likes that. No matter what team you're watching, there's good basketball being played, and you really don't know who's gonna win. With so much talent in the league during the regular season, the playoffs separate the competition and ultimately dictate how your career will be remembered. So what, you had a great regular season? That's cool. You didn't show up in the playoffs when it mattered the most. The playoffs are a testament to how good a basketball player you are. The playoffs either make or break your legacy. So players have a lot more to prove, and this year the stakes were high for everyone. A lot of players and teams are starting to get older or suffer from injuries, and some teams are entering a blow it all up stage. I mean, Jason Tatum and the Celtics are trying to prove that last year's championship wasn't a fluke. The Lakers, with their new addition of Luka, were trying to prove that they still had the same championship DNA without Anthony Davis. Cade and them had to let the haters know that Detroit basketball is back. The New York Knicks got rid of Julius Randle for Big Purr and thought things would be sweet. The Golden State Warriors dynasty is officially over, and Jimmy Butler still got paid. Ant and the Timberwolves fell short once again. Freak Time got stopped by Tyrese Halliburton again. The Unks on the Clippers are still cursed. Jokic lost his MVP race, and the Nuggets core looks like this. OKC showed us what a true first seed looks like, and the Cavs and Rockets proved that being first and second don't mean shit. All these narratives contributed to making the playoffs one of the most watched in 25 years. These are such good storylines and such good entertainment for the fans. It was amazing to see how aggressive, determined, and resilient some of these teams and players are. The drama is good in the NBA, and that's why the playoffs are so successful. And yeah, a few of these series look boring on paper, but if you really watch these games, you saw some of the most thrilling comebacks and insane shot-making capabilities. The 2025 playoffs were different, and this is why I think it was one of the most viewed. Thanks for watching.